Hi, Shaun here, and welcome to this skill where we're going to be taking a look at something called the GlideRecord API in ServiceNow. Now, this is something that we've been using, pretty directly over the course of the last few skills, where we've been learning about the basics of business rules in ServiceNow. But what we're going to do in this skill is we're going to take an official look at this API, and we're going to talk about what an API is in the first place, and we're going to see how we can use it inside our ServiceNow business rules and lots of other ServiceNow scripts as well. All right, so first things first, what is the GlideRecord API? Well, to give you a simple definition of this, right, when we open up, let's say, the incidents module under Service Desk, and our browser takes a minute here to load all of the incidents and then displays them all in a list, there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes there, right? So I'll go into a little bit more detail on how exactly this works shortly, but basically what's happening is our browser is sending a request to ServiceNow's servers, right, asking for all of the incidents that this current user should be able to see. The server is making a query to the database to actually load that data. And then once that data is loaded, the server sends that data back to our browser, and that's what we see displayed here, right? So, let me just draw that out, I guess, real quick. We have our three pieces, right? The browser, which I'm just going to draw like this. The server, which I'm going to draw like this, all right? And the database, which I'm going to draw like this. These are the symbols that I typically see drawn for these. That's supposed to be like two sort of like three-dimensional circles on top of each other, sort of like a layer cake. Anyway. So again, what's happening is when we open up the incidents module, our browser is sending a request to the ServiceNow server. That server is deciding how to handle that request, right? If the browser is trying to load data that the user shouldn't have access to, then the server is just going to say, no, right? You can't do that. But if the server, approves this request, then it's going to load data from the database. The database is going to return data that matches the query that the server puts together. And then, as I said, the server is going to send that back to the browser where it will be displayed as all of those little list rows. All right, so that's the basic process that happens. And what this all has to do with the GlideRecord API, actually I want that back there, so I'm going to put that drawing back. What this all has to do with the GlideRecord API is typically when we're interacting with ServiceNow through the interface, right, when we're opening that up, we define things like filters to determine what data it is we actually want to load, right? So we might say that we only want incidents whose priority is equal to 1, right? And we're also able to do things like, sort the data differently. So we're able to sort it by the, let's say, the short description of the incident. And all of those things ultimately affect the data that we see in this interface. So where I'm going with this is, now that we've seen the basics of writing scripts in ServiceNow, and we've primarily been using them with business rules, but there are lots of other places where you can use scripts in ServiceNow, I promise you that. We've started writing our own scripts, like business rules, I'm just going to draw that as BR here, that are actually executed on the server. Right? Now, that might not be obvious, and there are other types of scripts that are executed on the browser, for example. Things like, UI policies. Those are executed on the browser instead of on the server. Again, we'll go into more detail on that a little bit later. But these business rules are executed on the server, which means that our business rules should have the ability to interact with the database and load whatever data we want them to load. And that is exactly what the GlideRecord API allows us to do, right? So again, you can think of the, and here I'm going to just get rid of those there because that's a little bit distracting, all right? So you can think of the, when we're in the user interface, we're able to enter in filters, we're able to define how we want to sort that kind of thing using the little buttons, drop downs, text inputs that the user interface provides us with. But when we're writing a script, right, when it's a program that actually wants to do these things like define filters and sort data differently, that's when we use the API. Right? So there's the UI for users like us, there's the API for the programs that we write, and that is exactly what the GlideRecord API is. All right, so far so good. Hopefully this is making sense so far. Let's talk about some of the things that the GlideRecord API allows us to do specifically. Right? So again, these are all things that we're going to see how to do from inside the code that we write instead of in the user interface. Right? So the GlideRecord API allows us to do things like query tables. Right? So again, we can say things like, hey, I want all the incidents whose priority is between 1 and 3. It also allows us to do things like read the field values of different records that we load. We've already seen this actually, and in fact, that current parameter that we've been seeing when we write our business rules, that's actually a glide record, right? So again, we'll get back to that in more detail shortly. But another thing that the GlideRecord API allows you to do is modify records, right? So we can actually change specific, specific fields on records if we want to, add a description, let's say. We've actually done this in previous demonstrations, right? And in addition to this, it also allows us to do things like insert new rows. So if we want to create a new row in some other table in response to an incident that's created, maybe we want to automatically create a software development task in response to an incident that's been created, right? That's something that we can do with this API as well. And finally, it also allows us to do things like delete rows. And last but not least, it allows us to navigate things like table metadata, right? So if we want to see things like what columns does a table contain, that's something we can do with these glide records. And going back to what we talked about with reference fields a few skills ago, it also allows us to navigate references. So if we want to, this is actually something that's kind of tricky to do in business rules, is if you have a field that's a reference to another table, you're actually going to need to use this GlideRecord API to load data about that reference, right? You can't just automatically say, hey, I want the corresponding department data for this user. You actually have to manually make that happen, as you'll see with this API. All right, so anyway, those are some of the things that the GlideRecord API allows you to do. What we're going to take a look at next is we're actually going to create our own business rule that will help us see what these things look like in code.